for me, a large part of being an entrepreneur was I wanted to live true to myself, and entrepreneurship gives you that freedom, obviously, much more so than being employed somewhere. You can wake up every morning and to a larger degree define what you're going to do with an understanding of why you're going to do it. And I feel in many, many jobs, unfortunately, you're not afforded that freedom.
Yes.
You're neither afforded the freedom to choose what you're going to do, nor the why. And that's one of the beauties of
being an entrepreneur, right? Okay, I need to touch on something that's funny a bit. You said, I either become an engineer or social? Like, how is these two things competing?
So for me, when I was an electrical engineer or studying to be an electrical engineer, I was in labs for extended hours of time behind the computer over a circuit board on my own, trying to figure out a problem. And sometimes that was for days on end with no sleep.
True.
And typically when I'd hang out with other electrical engineers who were studying, I'd notice how non-electrical engineers who were part of the conversation had no idea what we were speaking about. It was a totally different language. It was the aliens speaking. And so again...
So that's why you were like, okay, makes sense.
I felt that engineering, at least what I was studying, and at some point I was doing as a master's degree, pretty advanced semiconductor physics. It was not a team sport. It was very...
It's like lab, you do all the experiments, you have the hypothesis, and then you test them, and then, which is, I understand. Okay, makes sense. I just wanted to clarify because I'm an engineer myself.
No, and when I first moved to Dubai, I worked in civil engineering, and obviously that's a far more...
human interactions,
collaborative, and
civil and architecture is obviously the beauty of building civilizations, because this is where you are able to manifest the creativity of your thinking, and how, like, look at, for example, the late Zaha Hadid and what she did in the world, and how her legacy and everything else around the world. So I agree with you. But that's a tangent, because in my mind, I have the same thinking as an engineer. Because I used to be an engineer. I'm still an engineer, obviously, because I used to have a university professor that said, once an engineer, always an engineer. You will have an engineering sense that will allow you to
view the world through that lens.
Exactly. And it's mostly a problem-solving way of seeing.
So I'll give you another.
Yes.
My university professor, engineering professor, also said a quote that was very memorable to me as I was considering the transition to investment banking. And he said, there are those who make cake, and there are those who pass cake around and eat from the crumbs. We as engineers make cake. And I was a back of the classroom kind of guy. I raised my hand. He was surprised because I was a back of the classroom kind of guy. And he pointed at me and he said, yes. And I said, yes, professor, but it's us, the ones who are making the cake, that are actually eating the crumbs. It's everyone else who's actually eating the cake.
Oh, goodness me. What did he say?
It certainly felt that way, right? As an engineer, you graduate and you make a modest salary. And as an investment banker, as soon as you graduate,
100%,
you're making multiples of that. And then if you look at the lifetime too, the investment bankers who are passing the cake around rather than making it are certainly well compensated for doing so.
The saying, you can't, have the cake and eat it too, right? So either eat it or have it. And, if you're smart enough, you'll be able to do both. But life tells us that you either make it or eat it. Okay, so what made you an entrepreneur here in Dubai?
Yeah, so again, I actually believe I've always known I wanted to be an entrepreneur, and in many ways, I realized very early on. So I've had one sort of job in my life, and I realized very quickly I was unemployable. And my bosses realized I was unemployable too. And so I figured if I was ever going to...
You had problems with authority, haven't you?
I have problems with authority. And so if I was ever going to have a livelihood and be able to provide for myself and my family, I would have had to generate my own opportunity. To me, so I knew... I say this all the time to younger people, and you probably heard it expressed many times, but over and over people have now said this concept of following your passion is really bad advice. And I couldn't agree more, because obviously most people don't know what their passion is. But I found that something that works for me tremendously well and has actually defined every inflection point in my life and most of my choices has not been about knowing what I want, but being very clear about what I don't want and seeking to avoid it. And so, my transition from electrical engineering to investment banking had nothing to do with me really wanting investment banking. I just knew very much that I didn't want to be an electrical engineer anymore because of the social aspect, and I just wanted something social. Investment banking seemed like that. When I left investment banking in the US, it wasn't about knowing that I wanted to come to Dubai in particular or knowing what I wanted to do. I just knew it was time to no longer be in the US in banking. When I came out here, I stumbled on the first opportunity I had, which was my father's business. My father was running a construction business, and he was kind enough to employ me at about 1/10 the salary I was making as an investment banker, and found ways to work me at least twice as hard, which is really difficult given investment banking is pretty hard. But he... I worked with him, and there was a lot I loved about civil engineering. And as you rightly said, this sense of pride of actually building things that will last for generations, that people live within and they create within is there are very few industries that are that rewarding from a personal perspective. But I also realized that industry had a tremendous amount of issues with it. Some of the issues were you were dependent on a very large number of suppliers. You were dependent on a very large labor force. Oftentimes, you were not being paid. And if you were being paid, you were being paid very, very late. So the variables were immense and the returns were very, very volatile. And I stumbled on a Fortune 500 magazine as I was working with my dad. And one of the things that ranked, other than the top 500 corporations in the world, was it categorized them by industry, and the lowest industry in profitability was the construction industry on average, and the worst in terms of at least that year. And you understand that it's a very cyclical business and with a huge amount of variables. And so I realized I enjoyed now the people aspect, and I enjoyed working in a family business, which was entrepreneurship, and I enjoyed the managerial aspect, but I didn't enjoy knocking on people's doors, begging for money, and then having 1,000 suppliers basically manipulating me the way they wanted to. And I figured, can I do something that is entrepreneurial, that doesn't have these variables?
That has at least a comparable power dynamic, right?
Yeah, and where I get paid on time, where I have minimal number of suppliers, where it scales fairly easily.
So at least you have control over the variables that you have, rather than just spray and pray.
Correct. Right? Yeah, and so I was on a flight back from the US at some point. I decided it's time for me again. I knew what I didn't want. I didn't know what I did want. I wrote on a piece of paper, just, I think, 40 or 50 ideas really quickly. I scribbled down, and then I arrived in Dubai, and I said, I'm going to start researching these ideas. And subhanAllah, one of these ideas, just all the pieces fell into place almost instantaneously. Every time I would knock on a door, that door would open up wide and sort of welcome me in. And that was my first entrepreneurial venture, and that became a great success, and it set me on my path.
So let me kind of drill deep here, because I know that many of our viewers are in that mindset now, and they don't know what to do, right? And it's very important that we, how do I say it, clarify the thinking behind it, because people think that it's just do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4 will happen, but there's much more than that meets the eye. So I'll start with my personal experience. And we exchanged before this recording a bit. And I told you that I never knew about the concept of entrepreneurship, that it's attainable in this way, in this easy way. Why didn't I know about it and you did? Now, obviously, you don't know me, but the point is, how come? Is it because of your family, your father? Why did you know about it since that early age?
So I'll actually say culturally, we intrinsically know entrepreneurship. If you go back to your grandfather's time, I would say 99% of the population of the region was either self-employed or employed in very small enterprise. And what I mean by self-employed, they had a store, they were a farmer, they were a fisherman, they were whatever it is, but there was no concept of large corporations in our region that employed a lot of people.
Oh.
And there was a lot of free will associated with that. There was the pride of, I run my own thing, I do my own thing. And sometimes it was within the context of a family, but that's culturally where we come from. And we didn't have this word entrepreneurship to contrast against something else. It was just our way of life. I think we are the product of mass education systems, right? And mass education systems, you enter a school, it's supposed to be 12 years of your life, followed by 4 years of university. And during that period, you learn a lot of useful skills, but you also learn conformity. And you learn that life is a series of drawn out steps. And typically in our generation, and I'm throwing you under my generation, though there is an age group, but I would say, there's a period of time where we became accustomed to that the best practice after university is to join a large corporation and continue on in that sort of classroom environment.
Conveyor belt, right?
The conveyor belt. And so I think intrinsically you and I and everyone else, and if you speak to your grandfather and your great-grandfather, that's all they knew. In fact, they would find this conveyor belt a bit strange. That you work in a pecking order of tens of thousands of people following orders. That to them...
It's very foreign.
It's very foreign. So for me, I saw, I knew my grandfather very well, spent time with him. I saw my father. My father obviously was the term these days is a Nakba survivor. My father as a 9-year-old was a refugee and was put through UNRWA schools, the UN schools, in order to conform, went to the AUB. But though he did join a larger company, he was always doing entrepreneurial things on the side. And in fact, we learned very early on that the entrepreneurial things are what he enjoyed most. Right. And in fact, they were what brought us most of our livelihood. So because he was refugee and the son of refugees, the job provided some semblance of stability, but the entrepreneurship was life.
Self-fulfillment.
It was self-fulfillment, financial fulfillment, and everything else. And so we saw that without it being said, and we knew that that's what we wanted for ourselves.
Yeah, makes sense. Because in my case, I didn't know my grandparents. Yeah. I just literally just a few months ago, I got access to my great-great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather and great-grandfather and grandfather's Ottoman Empire era birth certificates.
That's amazing.
Right? And every one of them, you see their father, they were a merchant in Jaffa.
Yeah.
And they were all, like you said, like the concept of being an employee is very foreign, right?
Unless you were a government bureaucrat, which some people were, but that was sort of a very small fraction of the population.
It's a very small fraction. And I think the point is education, like you said. It's just education. And if I remember correctly, I remember that since my younger age, I wanted to be an employee, to go through the corporate ladder, to become an executive and then to become a boss, and that's my world, right? And I didn't know any better. So that's important for everyone. I think nowadays, like I said, I'm not that old, you're not that old, but we remember a day without an internet, without a mobile phone, without anything, right? We just, I'll meet you at 8 p.m. in this, you go there, stand there for 10, 15, 20 minutes, 1 hour waiting for them. It's fine.
And it happened. It worked.
And it worked, right? It worked. But that time is when the time where you can't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
Now you just search, everything is there. But it's very important for people to know. So let me switch gears a bit and talk about Bait. And let's start with how did it start? And then we'll shift into the concept of employment, because we touched on that, and the job market and the kind of the tension between employers and employees. And so, how did Bait start?
So as I mentioned earlier, again, I knew I wanted to do something entrepreneurial. My first venture wasn't Bait. My first venture as a 25-year-old was a business called Infofort. And Infofort was that sort of the opposite of construction in all the variables that I talked about. So in investment banking, we'd produce lots of documents, things for clients, things we needed within the organization. And when we were done with the deal, we'd put them in an archive box, what's called a legal letter box. You've seen these boxes in the movies, etc. And we'd ship them off to a storage facility. And then if years later we needed something from a storage facility, we'd call them up and they'd actually deliver the box to us. And so one of the many ideas that I wrote on that sheet of paper was, you know what about this business that we used to put our papers in and bring it back from? What is that business? And so
as a problem that you want to solve,
as one of the 50 concepts and potential entrepreneurial ideas. And so I called up a buddy of mine in the US and said, you know, you're still there. We used to use this company. Can you call them up and find out more about them? And he quickly called back and he said they were very generous with the information. Here's the information you asked for, but they also told us there's a records management conference that's a global conference that's happening next week.
Oh, wow.
And, you know, you can access it if you want to. So I boarded a flight, flew out there and realized that this industry is one of the most beautiful industries in the world. And
what's the industry called?
It's called records management.
Records management.
Records management. Records being not music, but records obviously being
it's like data warehousing of some sort.
It's data warehousing. And for the most part, you know, things have changed quite a bit, but companies were required for legal and financial reasons to maintain hard copy physical documents. And even if it wasn't required legally or financially to keep hard copy, the digitized copy would cost you so much more
at that time
than actually storing the physical. It just made sense to have physical. And the beauty of that business was you'd rent out very low cost facilities, you'd set up all the security and safety, people would send their archival documents to you. They would hardly ever recall them. And so you have this tenant that's sitting with you paying rent every single month.
Very low maintenance.
Very low maintenance. Typically that grows every year at the rate of between 10 to 30%. And where, you know, my list of suppliers were minimal. I had almost zero labor to speak of. And everyone paid me on time because my contract said that if you don't pay me on time, I can actually physically destroy your documents.
Oh, wow.
And so, you
holding them ransom, right?
This was literally the opposite of construction. And so that business, it's a trust sell. It's very difficult to go convince a bank or a government organization that you should store your documents with me, not with you. But when they saw the facilities and the level of care we took, that was generally much higher than their own level of care and the technology we used, we were able to very, very quickly grow and expand. And that business within the first year was profitable and it grew tremendously. So within 2 years, we were in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, Khubar, Jeddah, Cairo, and started serving all the leading law firms, banks, construction companies, even government organizations. And so here I was, a 20-something year-old entrepreneur. I had started at 25.
With a positive P&L and
you know, totally bootstrapped, positive P&L. On paper, I was, you know, a very wealthy young man. And, you know, that seemed like the perfect thing. So, you know, I had gone away from what I didn't like to something I liked and it was working for me. But I also went back to this sense that things weren't right yet for me. And part of that was while I was doing something that was highly personally profitable, I wasn't contributing to the community that I was in. And to me, again, that's an important part of who I am and what I wanted to do. And so I increasingly started thinking about what can I do to further challenge myself, to continue to learn, to continue to grow, while also contributing significantly to my community. And I realized that the single biggest problem in the region is obviously we have the highest levels of youth unemployment in the world. And I felt that very personally, because every young person I'd meet whenever I travel would always say, oh, you live in Dubai, can you help me find a job in Dubai?
Right.
And meanwhile, every employer I spoke to was saying, listen, I'm looking for talent and I can't find that talent. So it seemed like it was a pervasive problem for which the systems at that time, and again, if you think this, I started the Infofort, which was my records management business in 97. So around the year of 2000, in most places, it wasn't easy to transfer your visas. Newspapers were not traveling across borders. So your access to information about opportunity and talent was very, very limited. And then in 2000, the internet switch came on. And when the internet switch came on, it became obvious that at least the information mismatch between employers and job seekers could now be solved.
Yes.
Right? You could create a single virtual marketplace where supply and demand can come together and opportunity and talent can meet and match. And so when that switch came on in the region, I decided it's time to now build a business that caters to that problem. And as a result, serves the community and hopefully is something that lasts and prospers. I just want to say that off of Bait, and you might not be aware of this, there's over a dozen other businesses that over the years we've propagated, some we've sold and exited, and they've been tremendous successes. Some that continue to live under the brand that people don't necessarily associate with Bait, but that continue to do extremely well. And going back to a sentence beforehand, in some cases, actually, they're massive net exporters of technology from this part of the world to the West. So you were mentioning earlier how we're typically importers of innovation.
For the most part,
and technology. So we have one company where we're the most highly rated platform of its kind globally. 90% of our business comes from North America. And it's basically Middle Eastern people exporting technology to the US as opposed to vice versa. So just to tie that up.
We'll talk about that because this is you see the reason why I reached out to you is to see how we can at least put it under the spotlight and have people look at it and see how they can copy the formula and make it as proliferated as possible so people can do more of it and becomes more known, right? Now, the one thing crossed my mind, or kind of, I love how everything about your being, your sense of being is value driven. So even your pivot, it's not because the market fit did not work, it's because your value system did not match that. And that's amazing. This is a breath of fresh air, I must say, because it's again, I keep on saying it's rare. I don't want to generalize. I don't know much. Obviously, I'm very ignorant in this space, but to see someone who is driven by values and then succeed. Well, what's your advice to people?
I believe, and again, I invite you to interview everyone who's been through the organizations I've started. To this day, every single person who joins, the vast majority, so there are occasions when, unfortunately, I can't, but the vast majority, when they do join in the onboarding training, we have a vision, mission, values presentation, and I try and present that every single time. And I reiterate to every single new joiner to our team that the reason that we've existed so long, so we're a 25-year-old internet business. We're actually the longest running internet business in the MENA region. We're one of the longest running in the world. And I attribute that primarily to the fact that we are a values-driven organization. I highlight very early on that neither our vision, nor our mission, nor our values say anything about money, because money is a byproduct of doing good and serving others. If we do something good enough and serve others well enough, then money will come. But if money is the objective, oftentimes you take shortcuts that end up being terminal illnesses that kill you. So I would say that businesses that do survive for long periods of time, and we're not unique in that, are and should be value driven.
How do you see the landscape of the current entrepreneurs, ventures? Do you see on the most part, are they this type of driven, or?
I see all sorts of things. Candidly, I think there have been a lot of, the market has been skewed in many ways by the amount of capital that's been thrown at it. So because increasingly the model for startups is to go raise venture money or third-party investment, and the drive of that third-party investment is always a return on investment or return on equity. And return on investment and equity has two parts to that formula. It has what is the terminal value you get, but also how quickly you get it. And that drives a lot of businesses to think a lot more short term. So even entrepreneurs who initially started off thinking, I want to build something that lasts a long period of time and that survives beyond me and that contributes to the community, very quickly that gets skewed when you bring in shareholders who say, listen, my objective is to give you money now and to get it out within 5 years, and you need to get me at least 3 times what I put in, otherwise I don't get a return on investment.
And the nagging every board meeting is, correct, where is it, where is it?
Yeah, and so the objectives change. And again, I think this model of investing is a relatively new one. So when I was younger, my dad would partner with friends and family members. And a partnership used to be that a family member would say, listen, I need $100,000 to start something. And, I don't have the $100,000. Can you give me $10,000 and you can get 10% of the business? Nowadays, you find a 20-year-old with a twinkle in his eye saying, I have this idea and it's worth $20 million. And therefore, if you give me, $100,000, you get some ridiculously small amount of the business. And if I'm going to do that, then my primary objective becomes, how do I push this entrepreneur to quickly get me my money back
returns. And that so do you think it's more on the founder's maturity or it's more on the investor's maturity?
I think it's a market dynamic, so I don't want to force it on. The market dynamic is...
The onus is on who? So whose responsibility is it?
I think it's... So I always ask founders, so I get a lot of less gray-haired young entrepreneurs knocking on my door because, again, they see the gray hair and they know I've been around a long time seeking advice or seeking investment. And my first question is really about what is your long-term objective? Mm-hmm. For any human being, as long as they're being true to themselves, it's going to be a great story. If you're not being true to yourself, you're building a tragedy.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is if someone really thinks I want to build a business that I can give to my great-grandchildren that can employ me for the next 30 years, and at the same time is knocking on VCs and trying to get a $20 million pre-money valuation, these two things typically don't go well together.
Absolutely.
So, but if your objective is, I want to build the business really quickly, sell it, and make a lot of money, and that's your goal, then
at least you're true to yourself.
You're true to yourself.
Right.
I see a lot of entrepreneurs who unfortunately are not true to themselves, and eventually, they pay the price for that. And there's learning for that.
So to uncover that dynamic, what I mean by, because you mentioned something very interesting here, and I think I've resonated with it, not because of my personal experience. I'm bootstrapping and self-financing, and I'll try to maintain that for as long as I can, because my business is mostly value-driven, exactly like you started and exactly like how you're operating your business now. But I'm consulting and working with lots of startups and venture builders, and the complaint always is that exactly what you mentioned, which is those VCs, whether it's angel investors, VCs, at any stage, whether even pre-seed, whether it's pre-seed, seed, especially when it goes into Series A and B, and then once it starts to Series B, where's my profit? That pressure obviously clouds the thinking. And then obviously the needle starts shifting and slowly but surely goes into a different direction than it started. So, but then it's the egg and the chicken. But then who's pushing is, the investors. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think it's like any partnership. It's like getting married. If you and your wife have widely different views of what life in your house should be or what your kids' upbringing should look like, then there's going to be trouble. And so as long as you're aware that VCs and private equity firms, their sole purpose to exist is to generate a return on investment. That's
then
why
don't complain.
That's what they exist. And so if you take that on, that's what you're accepting. And you need to a priori embrace that. The big challenge is when you don't embrace that, right? Yeah. When you think, I'm still going to be entirely in control of my business, I'm going to build it for...
That's being delusional, right?
Yeah, Yeah, and that creates a lot of conflict and issues, and it creates even internal conflict. So even if it's not conflict with the external investor, internally, I've seen this over and over again. The entrepreneurs wake up every day. Am I doing the right thing?
Yes.
And many times, they start doing the wrong things or things for the wrong reasons. And
because there's the two sets of expectations, and these sets of expectations are not the same. And I think one of the things that I always ask the founders is that, are you able to self-finance? Because or are you able to bootstrap as long as possible? Because as long as you're not able to, then don't.
Yeah, and some businesses, I mean, if you look at for example, ride-sharing business or ride-hailing business, right? These businesses are built to suck up tremendous amounts of cash off the bat. They're not businesses that are sustainable or buildable as bootstrap businesses, right? So if you're getting into them, the initial mindset off the bat should be, I want to take on as much capital as possible, and then find a way to exit as quickly as possible. But I'm building for scale. And again, some people are built for that, right? They're great at that. So I'm not built for that. So this goes back to my values, what I'm trying to do. But I don't judge the other people. I understand it. The worst is if someone with my values tries to do that, then it becomes
then the tension becomes it sucks them, and then they become always
everyone's likely to fail.
Exactly.
the business, me, and the investor.
And the investor. So and I think this is where the learning comes into play. And this is why most of the founders and the successful founders, rarely it's their first venture, don't you think? It's because they go through this learning process that you can't learn from books or even from education. You have to go through it to understand. It's like being a parent, right? Yeah. You can learn about it, you can read about it, you can hear about it, but until you actually parent a child, you'll never understand what it means.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say I've learned about entrepreneurship is there isn't a mold. Yes. I've seen people of all ages do it successfully, depending on what you term successful. I've seen people of all sorts of educational backgrounds or lack thereof do it successfully. It really is, it's a very wide array of possibility. And again, the more I do it, the more I realize that 99.9% of it is being at the right place at the right time and being very, very, very fortunate and lucky. So when you do get successful, it's the job of podcasts and books and videos and magazines to idolize the entrepreneur and to talk about all of their great thinking and work that resulted in something. But the reality is, more often than not,
humbling. Yeah?
You were at the right place at the right time, and you got very, very, very lucky. Obviously, you had to put some effort into it,
which brings the odds more to your advantage. But still, there's a massive element of luck. Okay. So let me kind of shift gears into the job market now, and let's, for our audience who are looking at you and looking at Bait and seeing or kind of in the job market now, searching. What's the state of the job market at this? Is it famine feast? Is it bull and bear? Whatever. What's the?
There hasn't been a time when there have not been jobs for good people. So employers, if you knock on every door of every employer.
Well, let me think. Let me have that single. Let me say it and correct me. There hasn't been a time where there wasn't jobs for good people.
Yeah, correct.
Wow.
Yeah. So every employer today or at any time in the economy that I've known, even when we went through global recessions that were very, very significant, we're still on the lookout for great talent because the vast majority of people were not fully satisfied with the talent that they have. So there's always job availability. And then the question is, there were times, so for example, I remember in the early 2000s when Dubai was just exploding in terms of size, and people from all over the world were pouring in, and it felt like people couldn't hire quickly enough. It felt then that if you had a pulse, you'd get hired. You show up in Dubai, you'll get a job. And more often than not, employers actually looked back at that time and said, we made a tremendous amount of bad decisions hiring just because there was so much demand we had to hire.
The noise was too much, yeah?
Yeah. But I would say, listen, the region still has a healthy amount of employment going on. The market is still very, very active. And if you're good, you will find a job. And candidly, to be good is always a relative term, right? You're good in comparison to others. In many ways, being good in our region is not very difficult, right? And
that's
so,
not very flattering, is it?
No, and I would say, so I'll take a step back. I have a tremendous amount of faith in the people in the region and their capabilities. And that's why I continue to do business here and why I do it in employment. I think to a large degree, our educational systems have failed us in many ways.
Agreed.
So you have some of the best caliber people in the world, put them anywhere else in the world, they produce.
They shine.
Highly competitively. And there's a story I often repeat, even for me personally, so I'll share it again here, which is, so by the time I was graduating from university, I had not really tasted rejection in my life. So at high school, I decided I wanted to be an engineer. I picked up what was a magazine at that time called the US News and World Report, which had a list of the top universities, ranks the top universities in the US. I applied to the top 10 engineering universities in America. The Stanford, the MITs, Cornells, Carnegie Mellons of the world, etc. And at the advice of my counselor, they said, you're highly unlikely to get accepted by any of them.
Oh, wow.
I got accepted by all 10 of them. I went to university.
Mashallah.
I did, alhamdulillah, very well academically. I applied to a master's program. I applied to 2 of the top master's programs in the US, got accepted to both of them. So I thought, listen, I've performed well. I've been at great institutions. Yes. Finding a job should be a cakewalk. And so when it came time to find a job, I went to the Career Center and I said, help me find a job. And they set up for me 6 interviews with 6 different employers, all brand names you will recognize. And I walked in there knowing that my transcript was great, knowing that I was graduating from a good university. So I felt quite confident that this would be relatively easy. And so I did my interviews, walked out confidently, and within a week to 10 days, I had gotten 6 rejection letters. Every single employer had rejected me.
Okay.
And so, to me, I was shocked by that. It was a very, very humbling experience that, with my grades, with my university, with
track record and everything,
what's going on here? And so I did what every good student does. I went to the library and I picked up books on job searching and job interviewing. And I realized I was doing every aspect of my job interviews incorrectly. I just wasn't educated about that. No one had taught me what that is. And so after I studied them, I went back to the Career Center, asked them to arrange a bunch of additional interviews. And lo and behold, this time around, I got 6 job offers. In fact, in one of them, an employer had flown me out to New York for what was supposed to be a full day of interviews with different people. 40 minutes into my first interview, they had borne the cost for me and another person to join me, whoever I wanted, to fly to New York to stay in a wonderful hotel. 40 minutes into the first interview, he says, excuse me, walks out and walks back in with a job offer and says, when can you join us? And so what you realized is I had the exact same technical skills for the job, but what I had added by going to the library is specific skills about this thing that I thought was entirely unnecessary.
Of presenting and conducting yourself.
We conduct surveys all the time for employers, asking them what's missing in the talent market out here.
Yes.
And you'd expect, you'd think terms like AI should appear first, or, a particular technical skill. But the vast majority of time, employers are complaining that the soft skills, like my interview skills, are what's missing. And you ask them, what are those soft skills? And they talk about things like the ability to think clearly, the ability to communicate clearly, whether verbally or
So
orally.
practically everything that the schooling system doesn't.
Doesn't even focus on, particularly in our part of the world, the ability to learn continually, the interpersonal skills.
Yes.
You know, the number of times I get the top student in his class interviewing for a job in the region, he comes in late to an interview, poorly clad, first words out of his mouth, first questions are, what is my salary? How much vacation time? You know, will I get paid for overtime? So there are very simple things to be learned. And so I continue to believe that there's a lot of opportunity in our region. There's a lot more opportunity for people to find jobs. And there's a mutuality of responsibility. Job seekers oftentimes complain, I'm a great person, why is the employer not accepting me? And I could have had that same framework when I got rejected in the first 6 jobs, but I realized I had to take personal responsibility. There was something I was doing wrong. And in that case, what I did wrong was I interviewed very poorly. And
let me dig deeper into your mindset at that point in time, because you've been a successful person in your education system all the way until the job interview.
Yeah.
So you're not accustomed to failure. What made you accept failure?
I mean, I had no other choice, right? So I think I wanted the job.
You had this choice of complaining.
Yeah, and you know, so one of the things that are part of our values in a company and that I interview and I care tremendously about, and I think is a key success factor in anyone's life, is something we call take personal responsibility. So, you know, again, I'll go back to my father's story, your father's story, and many others. When our parents were refugees,
yes,
it's not like they can blame the world and just sit back. They ultimately had to provide for us. They had to provide for themselves. And candidly, I never heard my father complain once in all my years of knowing him of, life was so hard on me, or look at the bad deck I was dealt. It was always, you know what? I woke up. I had to work really, really hard. I had to find a way to make things add up, and I just made it happen. And there are, unfortunately, too many people who at every failure blame externalities, and that doesn't help anyone. So the quicker we internalize our failures and ask, what can we do better, irrespective of the variables thrown at us, the quicker we are able to adapt and change.
That's very powerful. I'll tell you, I mean, one of the things that I always see is the rejection of failure. And once someone fails, the first thing is, it's not my fault.
Yeah.
It's everybody else's fault. It's the manager, it's the boss. It's like you always see people don't leave, their jobs, they leave their bosses. You see everything around you is conditioning you to everything except your own responsibility. And that hit deeper in my personal life as well, because every time I look at anyone, I say, okay, so what do you have in control? Like, okay, fine. Like you said, you've been dealt a deck of cards. What's in your control?
Yeah.
Like if you just focus on that and not even remotely think about everything else, you'll find everything you need. And I think this is what we lack in this part of the world. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. We could do better on it, and we should. And at some point, I was interviewing potential business coaches for myself. I did not contract with anyone, but there was one person in the interviewing process who gave me a nugget of wisdom that to this day I find invaluable. And he asked me a tremendous amount of questions in the process of me interviewing him. So he ended up interviewing me a lot more than
That's a good
I
coach.
interviewed. He's a great coach and has an amazing track record. And in the course of my sentences, I a few times said, yeah, I should, or I must do the following, or yeah, I could do. And he then on the call held me accountable to that. He said, all of those are excuse words. What you should be saying is, I will, right? And so when someone says, oh, we must do this, Does that mean you're going to do it? Or just this realization that it's something, I should lose weight or I should be doing more sport? That's just a cop-out. But when you say, I will do more sport or I will lose weight. And those active action verbs are great for anyone in the world. I mean, these are not just bad habits that exist in this region, they exist everywhere. But going back to the original point, I think in this region, we are hyper-focused from an educational system on the hard skills and on the soft skills that matter more to long-time life success. We underemphasize them.
A lot.
And that is to the detriment of everyone who comes out of these education
Exactly.
systems.
As a society, as a community, as a group of people at large. And I see this day in, day out, especially the more you read about, especially philosophy, psychology, and sociology, and you see how these are learnable skills. Now, either you're lucky because you've been brought up in a society or between people that actually have these, and then it becomes ingrained in you, or you don't. And if you don't, then how would you know? And I think this is my next question to you. And if someone, because if anyone, again, I keep on saying this, if anyone has been following you for any period of time, he knows that you don't know what you don't know, right? And like I said, no one wants their own failure. And if this is definitely going to, this mindset, this way of thinking, this lens that you see the world with, is definitely going to get you to failure. And there's no question about that. But how would you know?
Yeah, and so, I would say culturally, and we're talking on the macro level,
yes.
And then you can obviously take that to the individual level. But culturally, what I realized when I went to the US is by the time most American kids graduated from university, they had already had years of experiencing the workplace, starting all the way in high school. So they understood the importance of soft skills and they understood what skills they had to nurture for the workplace. In our part of the world, what remains fundamentally the norm is that by the time you've graduated from university, you've never worked a day in your life.
Absolutely.
And so you don't know what you don't know. And then you're suddenly, as I was, you get this punch in the face where you realize that, listen, I prepared for a bunch of skills, but they're not actually the important skills for work. And in fact, if you look, my electrical engineering degree, which my father spent a tremendous amount of money on, and I spent an immense amount of time and effort trying to excel at, I have not used a day in my life. Those are not the skills that I actually acquired at university. What I acquired at university was an ability to understand other cultures. I acquired an amazing ability to learn. I acquired an ability to problem solve on my own. I acquired an ability to research. And that's what served me to this day. It's not that I learned an amazing mathematical formula or some semiconductor physics theorems, which if you tested me on today, I would, I probably would get 0 out of 100 on.
Don't go there, please.
So I think.
But how? I mean, if
engaging our young people very early on in the workplace would be to the benefit of everyone. It would be the benefit of the employer. It would be because they are finding talent early on. It would be benefit to the young person who's learning because they're actually adapting to the skills that are necessary. And it's important for the universities because it's a real life feedback loop. Some universities are waking up to that reality and are engaging. So there is I'll cite one example. There's an MBA program. There's a university out of India called SPJM. And out of nowhere, I had never heard of them before. Many years back, they called us up and they said, listen, we're a leading program out of India, and we force every person who takes our MBA to actually do an internship with employers. We'd love to send some of our students to intern with you. We asked what our obligations were. There were almost no obligations, and we figured, why not? It's a community outreach. Let's try it. So they asked us, what do you need? We said, here are potential internships. These are the skill sets we need. They gave us 6 students. The 6 students again, these are kids studying for their MBA, came into the organization. They were with us for 3 months. All 6 of them were offered full-time jobs by us. So think about how mutually beneficial that is to everyone. For the university, they're showing 100% employment, and we continued then to engage with their program. For the students, they've gotten real-life experience that whether or not they were employed by us helps them. But in this case, they got a full-time job offer and they worked with us. And for us, we got a great way to find and access talent at low or no cost.
Absolutely.
And to find...
And they grow with you.
And they grow with us. And so that's a very simple program that just works. And it's shocking to me that not every university in the region is doing that.
Why is that?
So this university decided to invest a few resources in people who essentially act as salespeople for that organization.
Yes.
They're business development. They're saying, they're connecting the employer with the students.
And it's a KPI to show that they have employability.
So why don't other universities do that? I don't know. I mean, it's almost too simple to pass up, but yet the vast majority of universities do pass it up.
So every time I do one of those interviews, and the theme of this podcast is primarily the state of innovation in our region, right? Yeah. And the thesis, or not the thesis, the reality is we're trailing behind. We're trailing behind on every metric. We're trailing behind when it comes to exportation. That doesn't mean that we are not utilizing innovation in the right way and providing quality of life and economic prosperity for everyone who's consuming this lifestyle. And every time I speak with someone, especially at your caliber, they always point to education, university, and everything around that ecosystem. Now, in your case, there's a unique dynamic because you mentioned education, but also you have a much clearer and pragmatic view on the employers as well. And, you have all of these jokes and memes, and it's like, okay, I need someone who's a fresh graduate with 5 years or 10 years of experience. And then they always have this emphasis on experience. And now talking to you, I know why. Because probably they've had a bad taste or they've been stung by fresh grads who, to your point, and I agree with you, they just got graduated, they're 23, 22, 25, whatever the age. They've never had a salary in their life. They've never had a responsibility when it comes to work and contribution at the professional level. And therefore, why do I have to teach them? I mean, if this is the reality, you have the education system, you have society, and then you have the employers. I mean, where do we start?
So I think like everything else, this goes back to this value that I talked about earlier, which is taking personal responsibility. So each of us has to take responsibility for their own life. So if I were a young person starting off right now, what I would do is I would go off and try and find jobs as early as possible, no matter how well off I am, because the best guarantee of long-term success is that I'm continually learning and that I engage with the workplaces as early as possible. If I'm an education provider or I'm responsible for a university, the hope is that I do more to reach out to connect my students to the workplace. And if I'm an employer, again, it makes all the sense in the world. As employers, we continually try, whenever someone offers to give us their students,
yes,
we take them. And it's always been a wonderful experiment for us. Something that's very close to home for me is in, I would say, June of 2023, we had an organization reach out to us from Gaza and say, listen, we've got all these tech developers who find very difficult to find jobs in Gaza. They're graduating. We'd like to give them internships. And if you tell us what skills you're looking for, we can prepare them for those skills, or we can help recommend people who have those skills. And for the first 3 months, you don't have to, you pay something very nominal to us because we're training them. And so we said, okay, we took 10 interns from them. By September, we had made all 10 of those interns full-time employees. Now, we would have never, ever considered hiring someone from Gaza. Gaza is really far away. We know all the issues that exist with Gaza. Of course, yeah. But this was a very low obligation way of us engaging with our community and perhaps finding talent. And in spite of the fact, again, by October, so we had made them full-time employees. By October 7th happened. They continue to be on our payroll till today. We evacuated 5 of them who wanted to be evacuated to Egypt, and they continue to be 5 of our most productive developers across the whole organization. They've got such tremendous motivation, and they're extremely well prepared, and they're willing to do what it takes. And so you realize that, there's a lot of benefit to people doing that type of corporate outreach for all parties involved.
I think it requires a certain level of competency when it comes to identifying talent, but also the patience that you need to exert to be able to kind of nurture them and cultivate those levels of elements that then will definitely get, or you will reap the benefits from it. But the problem is it requires that level of competency, because if I'm an employer and I don't have that competency, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would say if an employer is in business, it has enough of a competence to employ people and not necessarily well, but to employ them. I think generally organizations across the world have a difficult time defining specifically what they want when they're looking to hire someone, and it's a universal problem.
So let me kind of razor sharp go into the now. So we know the employee job market. Let's go to the employer. What do you think of the maturity of the companies and corporates here and their ability to hire talent and their hiring and firing sort of framework around their organizations? Is it up to par when it comes to worldwide? What do you think in this region? What's missing?
So one, I'll say this region, obviously, as you know, is not uniform, and
there's a unique demographic.
City to city varies tremendously. So when you look at a very international cosmopolitan city like Dubai, it has a very different level of sophistication than other cities that shall remain unnamed for now, that are a lot more insular and don't get as much global talent or corporates. 2, it obviously varies a lot company to company, right? We get global top corporations with their HR practices in the UAE. So you get some of the best bringing the best of the best ideas and implementing them. And you get homegrown startups that are done by high school or university dropouts, and the sophistication can vary tremendously. So there's a massive spectrum, and so it's very difficult for me to generalize about what is the level of sophistication. But I can say that there's a universal problem. It doesn't have to do with this region, that if I'm hiring a digital marketing officer, what am I looking for? What set of skills, competencies, values, experiences apply to my organization, where if I find those, that person is likely to be able to contribute to my organization in a positive way. And to me, a good fit is oftentimes like a good marriage, right? The right wife to a particular husband or vice versa. She might be perfect within that couple, but put her with another man or put him with another woman, and that might be the worst coupling in the world. So someone's ideal might be someone's nightmare. And that depends a lot on people having a self-knowledge on their culture. So for example, like you said, my culture, what I try and promote and live is a values-driven culture. Now, there are lots of amazing people, who do really good jobs on living in structures that aren't value-driven and that can bend the rules any which way to get an outcome. That person might be phenomenal in that business, but won't survive very long in my business. So I think from an employer perspective, an employer should define what values they stand for very, very clearly. Should define early on what outputs they want from a person, because in many cases people are hired and that's not defined very well too. And then should be able to look through that to understand for those outcomes what work has to be done and what skills are required to enable that work. And that level of homework is rarely done, not just here, almost everywhere in the world. It's rarely done.
Why do I feel that you're trying to be politically careful about this part of? I'll tell you what. One of the things.
I'm not, because I actually do feel it's I mentioned we have many businesses. In one of my businesses, I reached out to two of my Stanford buddies, both of whom are CEOs of public companies in the US, and said, I want you as a board of advisors.
Yeah.
And we were looking to hire a lot of people very, very quickly. And the CEO of that particular business, our business, was wondering how he should define those jobs.
Okay.
And it was amazing. These are two people who graduated from the same university, both had great, companies that are public in the US, and both had entirely divergent views of what that job should look like, what that person should look like, and in fact got into this very interesting hour-long argument on that one call about how we should go about doing it. And I think that's perfect evidence.
It does. But I think what I'm trying to say here is and again, I could be wrong here, but part of my research is organizational culture.
Yeah.
And the maturity of how people, and especially founders, CEOs, managing directors, leaders of organizations, understand the value and the importance of organizational culture. And the way that I've seen is everybody understands that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And, it's the cliche that everybody talks about. But then you go to organizations and almost the practices that are related to A, identifying the culture, B, shaping it to the point that it matches with the mission and vision of the organization, and C, making sure that there is this continuous training and continuous reminders of people that this is our culture, this is how, and it's based on truth, based on cultivation, based on collaboration, based on partnership, and so on and so forth. And when you talk to people about it, it's like, and I keep on mentioning this, it's like when you talk to someone about religion or politics, everybody's an expert. And same thing with organizations. When you talk to leaders about culture, they're experts. They don't think that they need to do anything other than their own tacit knowledge about how to manage it. But then juxtapose that with, let's say, Silicon Valley, or even the States or Europe or London, you'll find that most CEOs engage in something called organization development networks, where these founders sit together and the only thing they talk about is what makes people tick. Now, maybe they're not value driven. Maybe they're like, how can we get the last dollar out of them? But if this is what they want, fine,
So, listen, one, I'll agree with everything you said up front, which is this aspect of defining your values so that they align with your mission and vision.
Not just performative, right? Meaningfully.
And meaningfully, and then training people on it and hiring people for it and rewarding it and making it pervasive is something I strongly believe in. Where I'm sort of going to disagree with you a bit is I don't believe people universally believe in it, nor do I believe that the belief in it is defined by which geography we're in. So I've sat across the CEO of one of the largest car companies in the world, the company you'll recognize, and company is very, very successful. And he said, vision, mission, values, I don't need that to run my organization. And this is a massive, long-running organization. I'm worried about execution right now, and that's just overhead I don't need to carry. And so, and similarly, I'll cite another story. So when I was at university, a gentleman older than me dropped out of university, even though he was doing very, very well, because he figured there was too much opportunity cost. And very interesting story, but I won't bore you with all the details. His company went on to become one of the most highly performing tech companies in the world. So he was on the cover of Inc. and Fortune and Forbes, and he was always on the fastest growing lists. And a lot of the best kids from my university, as they were graduating, he was snapping them up, including one of my closest friends who went on to head HR for him.
Okay.
Many years later, this friend calls me out of the blue, says, I'm coming to Dubai. we haven't caught up in a while. I said, it was Ramadan, come over for iftar. She came over for iftar. I'm like, what are you doing these days? And she said, I'm still working with the same entrepreneur. I'm like, at some point, I couldn't open a magazine without seeing him. I don't see him anywhere anymore. What's the story? Is he okay? She said, yeah, he's totally okay. I'm like, sorry, weren't you at some point, you headed HR, weren't you at some point like thousands of people? She's like, yeah, we were X tens of thousands of people. I'm like, how many people are you now? She's like, we're 3 employees. I'm like, 3 employees? How is that even possible? Is he okay? She's like, he's making hundreds of millions of dollars. I said, sorry, I don't understand. I want to understand. Explain this to me. And she's the person I said later on became on the advisory board who argued. She basically said this CEO woke up and realized he didn't enjoy running this corporate culture things. He always had to think about employee wellness and office environments, and no one was happy, and they were always demanding more and more, and that became very costly and very expensive. So at some point at the height of his empire, he shut it all down, started buying out software companies that were losing money. He would instantaneously fire everyone, shut down the office, which was the 2 biggest expenses, and then he would hire an army of freelancers around the world to do the work. And he is now the largest employer of freelance tech talent globally, and all he needs is 3 employees. And he believes that the freelancers are happier. They don't have to come to the office. They don't have to worry. They have their own wellness now. They can set up their own cup of coffee they want to. He doesn't have to worry about their desks and chairs and corporate culture and everything else. He's hired them to a task. As long as they submit the task, that's all he cares about. And he's richer than he's ever been.
But Rabea, this is, it's true. And this happens. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, sometimes we lose track of our intention and purpose as an organization because we are so fixated on this culture and foosballs and beanbag, and free lunches. But that's what I mean, that sometimes, or most times, it's performative. It's like CSR in organizations, right? It's just for marketing, doesn't have real meaning. What I mean is, and this is, so one of the organizations that I've done research on, everywhere you go, it's like, we care about our employees come first. And you can see that there's an element of care. But then when I went deep beyond the observable into the values and basic assumptions of the organization, it was clear that it was an extremely control-oriented culture. So there's an authoritarianism, there is lack of empowerment, there is sort of risk aversion, there is a lack of psychological safety. And that's here. And I'm sure if I mention the organization, of course you'll know it. But the point that I'm trying to make is, because of the unique dynamic of this part of the world, people were still performing well. So the company was on a growth trajectory of almost double-digit growth every year. Now that made the leaders of the organization think that, you know what, why do I care? Exactly. But then when I dug deep into the innovation and the way sustainable business can kind of take place, it wasn't there. Because people are not creative. People are just following KPIs and making sure that they kind of bite the bullet, put their head down and do. They can't obviously say no, because otherwise they'll be sacked, and they can't go to their mom's basement. They have to move back to their homes, and that's not something that they're willing to do. So that dynamic was very vicious and toxic and created this weird element that I've never read anywhere in the world, by the way, because if your culture is not really well and it's toxic, the company will just collapse. You talk about Nortel, talk about all of these companies that had all of these issues, and but here it's not happening. But so the question that everyone asked in that research is, until when?
Yeah, and again, so I'm going to go back to a premise, my premise, and this is a theory. I guess my theory has become over time that there are no universal truisms in business. So you will see people run really bad cultures, toxic ones, for long periods of time and still prosper, and you'll see people who really live wonderful cultures and fail, and vice versa. And so, what ultimately needs to happen is, going back to the taking personal responsibility, is what type of a business would I like to run and function in? And for me, again, this concept of hiring 1 million freelancers and being on my own is not something that would satisfy me. And so even if it made me a lot of money, it would make me uncomfortable because it was making a lot of money without me enjoying all the other aspects of my life, which is interacting with large numbers of people and engaging with them and creating a positive culture and letting them engage with each other that way. But for someone else, it's magical and might be much more magical than anything that I've created from an absolute returns perspective. So, I think the funny thing with business is we're trying to make it into a science when it obviously is not a science. It's an art, and it's not 1 + 1 = 2. No one can give me a formula that works in all situations.
So what do we do?
So what we do is we have to run it true to ourselves. And this is, companies succeed or fail more often than not because they don't reflect the actual needs and motivations of the stakeholders. Right? So if I want a company to be immensely profitable and that's my primary objective and that's all I care about, then that's what I should aim for. And if I spend too much time, like that gentleman, he cared about the profit more than anything else. Once it started being more about the culture than the profit, he realized it was time to shed a great company, even though it was a great place to work and everything else, because that's not what mattered to him. And so that company failed because of that. But then he built the company that reflected his motivations. And companies are as broad as the motivations of the people behind it. So I actually find the first step in doing what you're doing is really getting to the depth of what is your motivation as a primary stakeholder in the business, as an owner or as a decision maker. What makes you tick? And are you actually implementing what makes you tick? If you're not, then there's something to be changed. But I don't want to try and mold you into some textbook case, because I can give you a textbook counter case in business for every case you give me. For every story of success of, this great culture worked, I'll give you another case where that failed massively.
So in your opinion, I mean, then let's kind of end on that, because this is the intention of everything, at least I'm trying to do here by having these conversations. Why are we lagging behind when it comes to innovation, production, and exportation?
So I want to ask you the question of how you define innovation, and then we can, because that's helpful to me. Sometimes these terms have widely varied meanings.
I love that. Okay, so innovation, practically speaking, is either ideas that turns into paradigms or that changes with the way people live, in a way that people would jump on it and pay money for that. So that's one. It could be technologies, it could be theories, it could be research. So for example, if we take objectively, so innovation starts with an invention. So when I call innovation, innovation is something new. It could be a process, could be a product, could be a service, could be anything. But it could be an alteration of something that already exists in a way that changes people's lives to the better. So people can recognize it, and then people are happy to pay money for it. For example, Uber. Uber is a different way of doing things. Or the iPhone. The iPhone is a different product, and so on and so forth. If we look at our part of the world, and so let's go back. What made those products or services or ways of doing things manifest? Traditionally, it starts with a research. Because you have this massive research, like Google, for example. It was a paper, it was a research, and Bitcoin was a paper, research, and so on and so forth. Or it can be just an R&D from one of those big companies, and so on. So everything starts with the amount and the volume and the quantity of research at the get-go. So if we take that, we're almost miles behind from a research output only, purely, even if it doesn't manifest. So if you look at the research output, we're probably really behind. Universities or corporations. Now, let's talk about technology exportation. What are the technology exportation that we can say decisively that it originated? We have. I'm not saying that it's zero. But like you say, if we compare it to the rest of the world, we're always a blind spot. And then if we take global measures like the Global Innovation Index from the United Nations, which has 6 or 7 KPIs. Again, research output, technology exportation, patent applications, for example. That's a very objective measure. We are really, really behind, even if we don't have these patents translate into products. And then, I mean, again, this is my field of research. I don't want to bore you with, but if you look at the objective measures, but also the subjective measures, the qualitative way of business and the way businesses are done at a macroeconomic level, it's also lagging behind. If you have a heat map of the world, you'll find the West red, hot, you find the East red, hot, but then the Middle East is almost a blind spot, right? Again, and I say this with all the good intentions in the world of addressing the elephant in the room, so we're able to reflect, look in the mirror, and then say, you know what, this is okay, let's do this. And I've had, discussions with university professors, government officials, leaders such as yourselves, and so on and so forth. So that's what I mean by lagging behind. And of course, I'll be hubris if I think that there's one answer or we can reduce it to one answer. But at least recognizing that at least we're lagging behind is an important element of, okay, so what do we do about it? I mean, what do you feel about it?
Yeah, so I guess I'll go back to the original premise and then I'll move from there. So let's start with the definition of innovation. To me, the term innovation has a simpler definition, and the simpler definition is it's about doing something in a new way, either doing something new or in a new way. Very simple. Now, it may or may not be better, but ideally you want innovations that they're a better way of doing things, not a worse things, but just by doing something in a new way, you're innovating. And then the definition of what is better is also broad, because better is oftentimes within a context of time and geography and cost. And so what I mean by that is oftentimes innovation is about taking something that exists and actually stripping it out of features and making it much simpler, but as a result also much more cost effective. And the better, you're not actually adding, it's not always summative,
the features,
it's subtractive.
Yeah. Agreed.
But because it's good enough and it's lower cost. And so when you think about, the Tesla screen or the Tesla dashboard, that's considered innovative. But what it is, hey, I'm going to remove 100 buttons and make it a screen.
True.
It's nothing really
groundbreaking. Yeah.
Yeah, it's taking a screen, it's taking touch screen, it's taking software that we all know how to use, but it's basically subtracting, and we say that's an amazing innovation.
Agreed.
So innovation is something new. Hopefully it's better, and better is context driven. Now I find the next question becomes, are we innovating in this region? Are we doing new things that are hopefully better for our context? And I would say we're doing it at an amazing pace. I mean, you and I have been in the UAE for a very significant period of time. And I won't just say the UAE, but let me pick where I live. Think about the experience of everything in the UAE, from entering and leaving the airport, right?
Yeah.
The fact that our airports had e-gates before anyone else.
True.
The fact that we're able to walk directly from a lounge onto the plane, the fact that they attached it to a transportation system as an airline, the fact there are so many things that they've done that have made our lives a lot better, and they're all innovation. Now, do those appear in an innovation index somewhere? They don't. I'll share another innovation which I found very amusing. I just dropped my eldest daughter at university, and her American new friends, when they found out she came from Dubai, historically when people heard about Dubai, they'd say, Emirates Airlines or Burj Al Arab or Burj Khalifa or whatever. This time, a whole bunch of people asked her about a chocolate bar.
Yes.
That's a Knafe chocolate bar, right? And these are American kids who are like, have you had this chocolate bar yet? Now, is this chocolate an innovation? Well, a Knafe chocolate is really a chocolate with some pistachio, right?
Yes.
But it had not been done before.
Yes.
And, is it better? There's huge demand on it. And, so I would consider that innovation. And it's not innovation that will appear on anyone's list, but there are people all around the world standing in line to get that. So we have to remember that the vast majority of the countries that we live in have not existed for more than 50 years.
True.
Right?
True.
So, these are new nations with new borders, in many cases, which had tiny, tiny populations. I mean, in the 1970s, I think the population of Dubai was in the tens of thousands. I don't think it had reached 100,000 people. So in my lifetime, this tiny village has become a global city, and it's one of the most innovative cities in the world. So I don't think the measures that we're using are the right measures for innovation. I don't. And again, there's validation. Emirates Airlines is the most desirable Qatar Airways airline in the world. Why? They certainly haven't done the same things that United and American Airlines have done. They've innovated tremendously, which is what has made them the best. But that doesn't appear in an innovation index. So I think we're innovating, and as our populations grow, we will continue to innovate in a more rapid pace. I think the major distinction between our innovation, what's happening elsewhere, is primarily, to a large degree, it's about first funding. When you talk about, the innovation in the US, the amount of money that goes into encouraging that, whether at the university level where they press the universities to do original research, the federal government spends billions and billions of dollars every year on the university level saying, please invent new things. And then it's on the corporate level where all sorts of crazy ideas get financed, which gives you a tremendous amount of failure, but also has the runaway successes, which is almost like winning a lottery ticket. So you can lose on 99 terrible businesses as long as you end up with one great
that makes up for everything else. Yeah.
So I would say it's primarily a funding issue with a market size issue. So again, if you innovate something there with that level of money, it's much easier to then get it to scale than in our part of the world, which remains very fragmented, small markets. And our people are as inventive as anyone else. So
Absolutely.
You look at, and I can list you a long list of people who are Silicon Valley, who are, Arab Americans who actually went to Jordanian universities and grew up in Jordan, all of their education, and they went to US, and suddenly they're, CEOs of unicorns. Why are they CEOs of unicorns? Well, one, the fact is you can only become a unicorn where there's $1 billion to finance you, right?
True.
And that's happening in that market. So I'll summarize. I don't think we're not innovative. I think we're innovating at a tremendous pace, perhaps one of the fastest paces in human history, given how new our countries are. I believe that's only accelerating. I believe there are impediments in the amount of financing we have, as well as how fragmented our markets are. And I don't know if those will be solved, but I would say those are the two main obstacles that we have. If we had the same billions of dollars in the same size of market, we would be on the top of the list. And you look at the people who are at the top of the list, it's China and America, both of whom spend more money than our GDPs on innovation, and then have massive populations on which single markets with which to experiment.
100%. The buying power and the total addressable market for every idea is massively, exponentially, astronomically larger than we could ever think of here.
I think a lot of what we've learned, candidly, in recent past is, and we're learning it more and more, a lot of how we idolize the West and we're down on ourselves are myths. They really are. And there are contexts for their successes and there are contexts for our failures. But oftentimes people try and do a root cause analysis that goes back to the individual. And our individual is as good, if not better, than any individual anywhere in the world. So it's not we don't have a systemic issue with our people. And unfortunately, oftentimes from the West and East, there's a racist way of looking at us, and that I reject outright. We are newer countries with far less money who are taking off, but again, who've hit stumbling blocks around the way. But I remain tremendously optimistic about what we are going to produce. And increasingly, you're seeing it in the flow of people. More and more people don't want to be there.
Yes.
They want to be here.
I love that.
Just drive down a Dubai street and you'll understand.
Rabea, I'll tell you what, Rabea. First of all, let me just acknowledge the feeling that you've just given me by this way of looking at it. Because the more you go into the details of the academics and the systematic way of analyzing a situation, it's difficult for you to abstract yourself from reality as it is today. But then if you're a visionary in the way you analyze things and you see the trajectory and then where it's going, the way you've described it, is just unbelievably beautiful. And I have to tell you one thing. I agree with you on everything you said. To the point of, just a few days ago, I was engaged in a car accident. So someone just bumped into my car from the back, and it was like in the morning, and I was like, come on, why? So I just stepped down, and their car was gone. My car was a bit, so they can't move. My car was a bit also, and it took only literally 5 minutes on the Dubai Police app to report everything. So 3 things stood up for me, and that's the experience that I would always remember till the end of time. A, how civil the discussion was. So it's like, first thing is, are you okay? Are you okay? Everything is fine. That's the first thing. And then we looked at the cars like, okay, I don't think you can move. I can go. Let's figure things out first, and then so there's an element of discussion, right? That didn't go into anger or like the typical things that you would find people behave and emotionally react in an accident. So that's number 2. Number 3 is, okay, fine. So you stay. It was a lady. So you stay in your car in the condition. Don't worry. I'll take care of everything. And then obviously because she was the kind of the mistake is on her. So I was like, okay, just stay there. Give me your cards. 5 minutes. Dubai Police app. Everything is done.
And part of the reason why it's so civil is because we have trust in the systems. And
100%.
They've built that trust in the system through, again, actually fulfilling their promises and through systems, innovative systems that work. In 1997, I told you I started my first entrepreneurial business here. And I incorporated the business. And at that time, there were a few steps you had to go through, but all of it was, again, they were so decent dealing with government organizations. You had to go through multiple steps, but the steps worked. And I was incorporated in far shorter time than I expected to be. But then what amazed me was 2 weeks later, I get a phone call and, hello, this is X from the Dubai Economic Department. And to me, getting a phone call from a government anywhere in the world at that time was a scary prospect.
Like customer excellence program, right? You find it only in
And it was
private.
A customer excellence program. They called me up. Wow, how was your experience? How did it go for you? And I was shocked. I had been in the US for so many years. Even government there, I was used to just really tremendously poor service. And that was supposed to be the gold standard. And here I was in a startup nation, literally in a startup nation, very young place. And not only did they incorporate me, but then they were worried about how satisfied I was. And that mentality has pervaded in everything that I've done here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think.
So this is where I agree with you, and there's no but, and 100% everything you said is on point. The way I see it is that's 50% of the story, because, and going back to my car accident story, now I have to deal with insurance and with agencies and that, and I had to go sit somewhere, take a ticket, wait until the agent comes to me, and I had to waste 3 hours of my time just to kind of fulfill. Imagine how it's flipped. Private companies here are not as innovative as the government. And this is where I keep on saying the government here have done like things that is completely unheard of. I mean, the way people study Dubai, and I work with the universities here, government universities, who just literally bring people from, heads of states from other parts of the world to learn about the Dubai model, right? But that's always the 50%, because you don't expect the government to do an app, like for a WhatsApp, for example, or a communication app, or a ride-hailing app, whatever. You don't expect them to do it. It's about the organizations, about corporates such as yourselves and others who should bring the other 50% of the story. And I think this is what I try to kind of emphasize a lot, is those startups, those family businesses, those corporates that are born and raised here, not the multinationals that come in. Because most of the multinationals that come in have one goal and one goal only. Obviously, I'm generalizing, but that's is to take as much money from here. And that's why all of them have sales offices here only. They don't have R&Ds here, although of everything you mentioned. By the way, I've confronted those companies in events when I was kind of facilitating, moderating sessions, or in talks like this. Like, what's the reason? You have all the talent in the world, especially in Jordan, here in Dubai, obviously in Saudi and others. What's the reason? And obviously they have no reason other than, why should we? I mean, we're Americans, we're UK, we're Europeans. We care about that part of the world, not here. So obviously the onus is not on them, because why do we? I mean, it's not their region. The onus is on us. And I go back to your point, which is taking responsibility of our own destiny through addressing what's reality, and then being optimistic about the future, but knowing where to go. Governments have done exactly what they should do: facilitate, provide, and making sure that everything is done in the right way. But that's 50% of the story.
Yeah. So I'll say the following. Most of us in our summers end up traveling around the world, and many of us end up being in Europe and North America. 30 years ago, the narrative of what it meant to go to Europe and North America on a summer vacation or otherwise was very different than the narrative today. The narrative today is almost universally, I'm finding it difficult to find transportation. I go to restaurants, I get bad service, there's long lines, the hotels are old and decrepit, the technology isn't as good. And if you look at most of those services, they're being offered by individual institutions here. When you go to a restaurant, it's not the government at that restaurant. True. When you're staying at the hotel, it's not owned in most cases by the government. A lot of the service providers that you find here, whether it is your ride-hailing app or other things, they're actually being provided increasingly by local providers.
True, with a higher quality.
With a higher quality. Yes. It used to be that we'd all eat at international restaurants that showed up in Dubai, but now what's most popular are homegrown concepts which have huge lines on them. So again, I feel that world is changing. And I think, again, the primary impediment remains an impediment of scale. For any company to become a global innovator, you need a market to validate that innovation and to pump cash into it to expand it out. And unfortunately, our markets remain more modest in size.
Yes.
And it's not because, when we think of the Middle East, we think of Morocco to Oman, but we all know that's not, the reality is if you open up a business in Dubai, it doesn't make you able to operate or access that market. Yeah. Meanwhile, if I do set up a corporation in Delaware, I can access the rest of the United States with almost zero impediments, right?
Yeah. And you're not the only one who's highlighting this. I mean, I've had people on this show that actually mention this quite clearly, and sometimes not just from country to country, sometimes from city to city.
For sure.
And that's, I think, my hope is to bring some official here to see. Now, I know that there are talks at a certain level, and this is probably way above my paycheck and what I can influence, but at least the discussion, the public discourse is clear enough about these issues and challenges. Maybe it's just a matter of just one small, slight calibration, and then floodgates would open. Because like you said, the soil is ripe, and the talent is there, and everything is just going in the right direction. It's just these little challenges, if we're able to address them correctly, then things will move in the right direction.
I'm similar to you. I've read a lot of business books, and there's always some business academic who's trying to figure out which variables are most important to a business's success. So is it the entrepreneur? Is it the values? Is it there's
the
a
culture,
huge number
the
of
strategy,
cultures, etc. But I would say the most commonly one I've seen cited and the one I believe the most in is ultimately what they call the sandbox you're in, right? Which is the market you're in.
Yes.
So if you're starting a very innovative mobile app in Dubai versus New York versus Kabul, there's a progression in where it's most likely to succeed, and why New York might offer you the greatest chance of success is because you're going to access the greatest amount of capital there to back you, which lets you be more experimental, and then you're going to access the greatest market to buy from you, which then is the best way to sustain the business. While if you're in Kabul, you're highly unlikely to get capital to finance you or to get a marketplace that can get it.
Utilize,
And so there are definitely overall market dynamics. And listen, when I came to the region, I knew that if I stayed in the US, my feeling was I perhaps could have made a lot more money a lot more quickly. But that's not what life is about, right? At the end of the day, life, at least for someone like me, is about getting all of the things that matter to my happiness and to my self-fulfillment together. And so money is important, but beyond a certain amount of money, it becomes irrelevant. It's a game.
Yes.
And there were many other things that mattered. And so, while innovation is important, I hope that we don't prioritize innovation over other things that matter, including our safety, our security, our sense of personal well-being, our cohesiveness as a society. Because, many times you can win the battle of innovation at the cost of a lot of these things. And that would be the greater tragedy. I would not like to see that.
That's absolutely powerful. Where do you see Rabea in 10 years?
So, I don't see Rabea. I don't have a clear personal vision. Listen, I am, my life is full of gratitude. I would just say that. I've really been in an extremely fortunate position all of my life. And that, I can only be grateful for that. And so with that great amount of blessings comes a lot of responsibility. And I feel a lot of my life is about not accumulating. At this stage in my life, I'm now in my early 50s. It's about how I magnify my impact. And I'm always looking for different ways to magnify that impact. And so, wherever I find that journey is where I'll be, hopefully. And I'm also, again, I think what defines me is, to a large degree, my Palestinian descent, is this realization that, my father had to make so many different transitions in his life, from Palestine to Lebanon to Kuwait to the US to the UAE, each time thinking this is going to be home, and then for something that was entirely out of our control, what was meant to be a stable and wonderful existence was no longer that. So for me, a vision is not about a geography, nor is it about a particular profession, nor is it about a particular wealth. It's about living a good life, and hopefully one that's meaningful both for myself and those around me. And that's what I aspire to do.
What about Bait?
So Bait's been an amazing journey. So as I mentioned earlier, initially I built Infofort. I then started Bait. Both at some point were growing at a crazy pace. I then got married. My wife got pregnant. I realized that I had 2 business babies that demanded all my time, and then a wife and a real baby coming to the world. I sold Infofort to Aramex, who continued to operate it profitably. They were going public, and it was a highly profitable business for many years. They recently sold it to the leading player in the world, a company called Iron Mountain. So this business, I take great pride in building a sustainable business that has now existed for 30 some years and that continues to do extremely well. And then within the Bait infrastructure, Bait then has been a launching pad for business after business. So the first e-commerce exit in the region was a company called GoNabit. It was a group buying site like Groupon. So that was a Bait launched business. We owned 90% of it. We found the CEO, put him in the position basically, and grew that and sold it. Mom's World, you might have heard of was basically built and incubated in Bait, and after a year spun out and went on to it.
So Bait is not just a employer-employee sort of marketplace.
We've leveraged this.
You're also an incubator, or
not officially as an incubator, but because we started so early and because we were profitable and cash flow positive,
you are able to kind of contribute.
Able to build out a lot of other businesses. So I mentioned we have a business now called VFairs, which is a virtual event platform.
I know it, yeah.
And it's again the leader in its
field. VFair is Bait,
globally, and that's owned by us, and that's around 400 people, and 90% of our business comes from the US, and that business, I mean, has the most unbelievable metrics you can imagine, and again, wholly owned by Bait, but it's a different brand. And there are several others. We have a business called Yalla Motor, which is an auto classified portal, which is also wholly owned by Bait. We have a business which is a leading applicant tracking solution in the region called Talentera. So people recognize Bait as the job site, and the job site continues to exist and continues to prosper. But I have a platform which I go to every day, which empowers my own life, right? It allows me to learn and grow and contribute. And then it empowers a lot of people to live their lifestyles of choice, which is ultimately our mission, which is to help people lead, the lives that they desire. And so from helping them to find a job, to a car, to
building companies. Wow.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. Shukran lak. Thanks.